as I said, I spent a bit of time in politics, in professional politics. I was doing some policy work and political advice work and some speech writing. And it was kind of my second job out of university. And I was in my 20s, and me and my colleagues and mates, we thought, as you do at that age, quite a lot of ourselves. And so we used to watch this old political drama that I hope most of you have heard of, called The West Wing, which still remains the best political writing, I think, in my view, in history. But The West Wing tells the story of a fictional White House presidency. And Aaron Sorkin, the guy that wrote the series, he invented this president using bits and bobs from various presidents in US history. And he invented this president, Josiah Bartlet. And one thing he took from President John F. Kennedy was a tiny little plaque that JFK had on his desk in the Oval Office. And so you'd see this a lot watching The West Wing, and we used to watch it a lot while we were kind of in those years and in that season of life. And the plaque said something that used to intrigue and astonish and always impress me. And it said, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small. The sea is so big and my boat is so small." And that impressed me. You know, we were working, at least in the halls of Australian power, with the cabinet process, working with cabinet ministers, working with prime ministers. But for the president of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world, politically at least, to have that on his desk, "The sea is so big, my boat is so small," for me was an important and relevant, and I think correct declaration of how we all feel sometimes, regardless of what profession you're in, what job you're in, what season you're in. That the world is uncertain, and that sometimes, increasingly, we feel like we have less and less control over what's going on around us. There's increasing uncertainty, there's increasing chaos, there's increasing anger, grumpiness, division, polarization, confusion, all of these things. I think on any measure over the last generation or two, the last 30, 40, 50 years, all of these things have increased, at least in some regard. There's a British journalist called Malcolm Muggeridge. He said that history is just the same stuff happening again and again to new people. And I think that is correct. But I think at the same time, it is getting trickier and more uncertain out there. So how do we navigate that? How do we find hope? How do we find some sense of stability in the midst of all of that uncertainty? I want to talk about three ways, at least three things that we need to do, three things that we need to rethink in order to do that. Firstly, I think we need to rethink the uncertainty itself. We need to rethink uncertainty, we need to rethink independence, and we need to rethink success. Rethink uncertainty, rethink independence, and rethink success. First of all, we got to rethink uncertainty. Now, the economic and leadership and future theorists, and there might be some of them in the room, are telling us that the world is more VUCA than it's ever been before. Some of you will have heard of this. VUCA, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world is more VUCA than we've ever seen before, which means that as our artificial intelligence, as our algorithms, as our models, as our systems of prediction continue to advance, the world seems to keep dodging and ducking and diving and spinning in ways that defy those models, that defy those predictions, however precise and however much they might be improving. There's a future forecasting expert called Philip Tetlock, who wrote the book Super Forecasting some time ago. Some of you will be familiar with. And according to his modeling, by looking at, I think, thousands and thousands of the world's best forecasters in various disciplines, even the best forecasters and predictors in the world are wrong on average between 30 and 40% of the time. So it's just tricky. It's tricky to try and work out the uncertainty. And yet the prevailing cultural message out there for all of us in every sector of the economy is that the way to deal with uncertainty is to try and read what's going to happen next, to try and predict, to try and kick the ball to where people are going to be, whether it's predicting markets, whether it's predicting trends, whether it's predicting supply and demand, whether it's predicting politics and policy, whatever it might be, we're all trying to work out what's going to happen next. And yet that's clearly and evidently increasingly difficult. There's a guy called Nassim Nicholas Taleb that many of you will have heard of. He wrote the book, The Black Swan. Now, the black swan's an old ancient term, actually, from literally the ancients, the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. But Nassim Taleb kind of popularized it with his book. And the black swan is, of course, an event that just comes out of nowhere. It seemingly defies our models of prediction. So 9/11, was a black swan. COVID was a black swan. These things that we don't seem prepared for, they upend our understanding and our models and our systems and our expectations. Now, We're in Australia, so this won't be as big a surprise to you, but I grew up in Perth. And when I was studying the concept of the black swan, which is a very common economic and financial term, it was very confusing to me because in Perth, all the swans are black, right? And even on the eastern seaboard, there's a lot of black swans out here. But in Perth, all our swans are black. I don't think we have white swans in WA. We have a river that we named the Swan River because of the amount of black swans we've got. And so I was really confused because this seems to be someone and an entire system of economic and financial forecasting that's talking about black swans as something unexpected. And it's, of course, because most of the thinking behind this came out of the North Atlantic and continental Europe, where all the swans are white. That's why they call the unexpected event the black swan. But increasingly, the 21st century seems to be much more anchored in the Perth paradigm of thinking than it is in the North Atlantic paradigm of thinking, where these days every swan is black. Every morning there are black swans plastering our newspapers and our media headlines. There is just unexpected thing after unexpected thing after unexpected thing. And so we have this understanding, this backdrop, this existential backdrop that the sea is big, our boat is small, and the sea is stormy. And the prevailing cultural message we give each other is to try and predict the storm. But the storm is increasingly unexpected. And so what we seem to need more when we rethink uncertainty is some kind of an anchor amidst the storm and amidst the uncertainty, rather than better systems and models to forecast. Because the thing about forecasting, regardless of what your discipline is it's dependent on data. And the thing with data is it's always from the past. And when you have more and more black swans coming, it doesn't matter how good your data is, it doesn't matter how good your models are. If the black swans are coming, they necessarily defy what's happened in the past. So we can almost modify Muggeridge's claim that that news is actually different and different things happening to different and different people, rather than the same old things happening to different and different people. So when we rethink this idea of uncertainty, what we see that we need is actually an anchor amidst the storm, something to hold on to. And that makes sense. Even the metaphor holds. A ship in the storm is subject to the rough and tumble of the storm, regardless of how good the ship is. It doesn't matter how much you invest in the ship. If it's in the storm, it's in the storm. The only way to offer some kind of stability to the ship is to anchor it to something outside of the storm, either the land or the seabed or something that transcends the storm. So in rethinking uncertainty, it's worth thinking about that. So we actually need some kind of an anchor in the storm, not better efforts to predict the storms. Secondly, we've got to rethink this thing called independence. Now, the prevailing cultural message here is very simple. It's the Frank Sinatra, I did it my way, or the more contemporarily understood, you do you, your best self, your best life. Just dig in and do what you've got to do to lift yourself up. There's an old movie called The Martian. It stars Matt Damon, an astronaut that finds himself stranded on Mars after an industrial accident hits humankind's first space station on Mars. And he's in this ridiculous position where he has to regenerate his oxygen supply, grow his own food, make contact with NASA headquarters, and somehow try and make his way back. And the spoiler is that he does make it back. And I don't really apologize for that because the movie's like 10 years old. You should have watched it by now. It's also Matt Damon. You're not going to cast him and then kill him off halfway through the movie. So he makes it back. In the last scene of the movie, this guy, Mike Watney is his name, the character played by Matt Damon, he's in a room just like this, actually, speaking to a group of NASA cadets, right? Similar sized group. And he says to them, and he speaks, of course, metaphorically and literally, he says, you need to apply yourself. Because when you're out there, you're going to come across problems. And when you face a problem, if you solve it, then you'll be presented with another problem. And if you solve that, you'll be presented with another problem. And if you solve that, you'll be presented with another problem. And he goes on like this. And then he says, and I think this is the last line of the movie, if not one of the last, he says, and if you solve enough problems, you get to come home. If you solve enough problems, you get to come home. That captures the modern, free market, wealthy, democratic, industrialized cultural paradigm when it comes to the promotion of self-reliance and independence. Self-actualization, some of the old moral philosophers used to call it. Charles Taylor calls it the age of authenticity. There's another philosopher, the name escapes me now, calls it expressive individualism. But it's the same stuff. It's the Frank Sinatra stuff. It's the I did it my way. It's the you do you, your best self, your best life. The problem with that is we wind up like atlases with the world on our shoulders. So it can be crippling when it's all up to us to deal with all of it. When we're reliant only on ourselves, when we think that we have to be independent, we feel the weight of the anxiety, which is what's causing a lot of the anxiety today in the world across generations. The second thing that happens with this increasing kind of faith and reliance on ourselves is a misunderstanding about how dependent we actually are. If we build our identity on the idea of, let's say, financial independence, right? Our stock portfolios are well diversified, our property portfolios are looking good, the company that we're working for is doing well, we're hedged well, we're saving well, we've got cash, bonds, and equities, we tick all the boxes. All we have done is become dependent on the idea of financial independence. That's all we've done. We've just shifted it. We're still dependent. If we talk about being emotionally independent, like I'm okay, I've got lots of friends and I diversify my friendship groups, my relationship is going well, I have friends across generations, or I'm so strong I don't even need friends, whichever way you want to look at it, all we've done is become dependent on the idea of emotional independence. So the question for us is not so much, can we be independent or not? Everyone's dependent. If you're a human being and you're breathing, you're dependent. The question is, can we find objectively trustworthy anchor points and targets for our dependence? Can we find things that are worthy of our trust and worthy of our dependence? Can we find things that are trustworthy and dependable towards which to point our dependence? We don't get to choose whether or not we're dependent. We all are. The question is there something that we can target our dependence at? So when we think about uncertainty, what we see, what we need is a need for an anchor amidst the uncertainty. When we rethink independence, what we actually need is an objective target of our trust for our dependence. Thirdly and finally, we've got to rethink success. Now, this is a whole 2 or 3 PhD theses, but just in a few minutes, broadly speaking today, we've reduced the categories of success to, I think, around 4 different things: achievement, accumulation, status, and experience, right? Achievement, the things that we achieve, the credentials that we've got. Accumulation, getting stuff, buying stuff, our bank accounts, our super accounts, our stock portfolios, our homes, our wardrobes, whatever it might be. Status, what other people think of us. And experience, the things that we do, the pleasure that we have, the convenience that we have in life. And a lot of these things are melded in with each other. So a good example of how experience and status work together these days is when we go on a holiday, or when you're at the Taylor Swift concert that you somehow got the ticket for, it's just not acceptable to just go to that unless you post that on social media. So it used to be that experiences were good enough. That's not enough anymore. People have to see it. I had the curious and coincidental opportunity to go and see the Mona Lisa twice, 10 years apart. And from the first visit to the second visit, it fascinated me. When I went in the second time, very few people were looking at the painting. This is in the Louvre in Paris. The second time I went, everyone was looking away from it with a selfie with them in the painting. And I saw people that didn't even look at it after the selfie was taken. So that is status and experience. And of course, achievement and accumulation are always there. They've been there for thousands and thousands of years. And there's a lot of interesting sociological and psychological reasons why these are our new metrics of success: achievement, accumulation, status, and experience. One of them, and it's worth us just pausing briefly to understand this, because we often don't think about the reason why, is just because of how successful we have been as humankind in the last few hundred years in generating wealth, right? So there are other debates to be had about how well that's distributed and how that's been utilized. But according to the data that we have, pretty much all through human history, economic growth was tracking across the human population at 0.1% per year, which, as most of you know, is pretty much nothing. It's a rounding error, right? If our economy tracked like that, if the economic figures that came out a couple of weeks ago was a 0.1% change, they'd say the economy is stagnant. So we did that for tens of thousands of years. But then in the couple of hundred years since the first industrial revolution started, so pretty much since the printing press, we went from 0.1% per year to an average of 4% per year. And obviously many years where it was tracking much higher than that. And even now there are developing countries that are tracking at 7, 8, 9% per year. But the point is, we went from 0.1% economic growth for about 50,000 years of human history to 4% a year for the last 300 years. Now, it doesn't matter who you are. for what you do here. I suspect that, working for a not-for-profit, I assume that if you're here and you work here, you're making lots and lots of money. But if someone increased your salary by 40-fold tomorrow, that would change the way you smiled and thought and spent money, and that would change how you felt. It would change how you behaved. It would change probably what you did this weekend if your income was to go up by 40-fold. That's what we as a species have had to negotiate for the last 350 years. And we haven't really thought about it or talked that much about it. We've just kind of done it. So that's an important pointer to why we are kind of where we are with our metrics of success as they are, because there's just a lot more material for the ism to latch itself onto. Isms don't just latch onto nothing in particular. The reason we have materialism is because there's a lot more material for the ism to latch onto. The reason we have individualism is because the individual has been elevated and inflated with this idea of self-reliance and self-actualization. That's why the ism has attached itself. So these metrics of success are just kind of given. They're just kind of the cultural waters in which we spread. There's that economic story. There's also, and very quickly, the psychological story. And the psychological story is an interesting one too. There's lots that can be said, but I want to, just as an example, use this thinker called Edward Bernays. He wrote a book called Propaganda around the turn of the century, going from the 19th to the 20th. Eddie Bernays is not a well-known guy. Some of you will have heard of him. If you're in marketing or anything, you will have heard of him, or behavioral psychology. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he used a lot of his uncle's early findings from the 1800s to effectively help invent the modern profession of marketing and advertising and consumer behavior. And it wasn't just him, so this is an oversimplification, and I apologize for that. But Eddie Bernays and his contemporaries at the time, they came up with this idea that, again, is just the cultural water in which we swim now, but was groundbreaking at the time, of getting people to buy stuff based on desire rather than need. And if you look back in the 17 and 1800s at the advertising, because there was advertising, there's been advertising for much longer. The advertising was, put simply, just pretty lame. It's basically like, hey, you use soap. You probably got some soap at home. When you finish that soap, you'll need some more soap. We make soap. When you need more soap, come and use our soap. That was the metaphysical depth of the advertising. It was just replacement. It was just whatever you need. When you run out of that, come and get another one. And Bernays said, if we can get these people buying stuff based on desire, based on how they think about themselves, based on identity, based on status, then we can sell them a lot more stuff. And so free market capitalism that had been slowly rolling in second gear for 100 years or 200 years or so really got its wings, because we just started buying things based on desire rather than need. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. It's raised living standards, ridiculously and enormously over the years. And there's other very positive things that have come with that accumulation of wealth. It's still a sad curiosity, but more people die now from eating too much than eating too little. Now, that's something we've kind of overcorrected the other way, and we still have work to do. But the idea that we shifted to consuming based on desire is significant, because we're all in those cultural waters. And I'm not saying for a second that we're all materialistic. I don't think that we all necessarily are. But if you, like me, have more pairs of shoes than you have pairs of feet, then you're in there. You're acquiring things based on more than just need, more than just subsistence. Gentlemen, if you have more shirts than you have torsos, then you're there. Ladies, if you have more dresses than you have bodies, then you're there. So we are consuming based on desire. We are generating wealth collectively at the fastest rate in 60,000 years. And this is all feeding our metrics of success. Why is this all worth thinking about? Because even though we are more technologically, academically, financially, and materially advanced than ever before in human history, all of the other metrics of human well-being and life satisfaction are either not moving at all or they're going backwards. So we know that in OECD countries, which are the wealthiest countries, that the greater wealth per capita, the greater the GDP per capita of the country, the greater the need for psychologists and psychiatrists per square kilometre, right? We know that in the Harvard study, the longitudinal study, that there's no correlation between annual income increases and end-of-life satisfaction looking back upon your life. Like no statistical correlation. It increases somewhat up to relatively modest figure of about 60 or 70,000 US dollars a year, and then it completely levels off, meaning there's no life satisfaction difference statistically at all between someone who spent their life on 100,000 Australian dollars a year and 100 million Australian dollars a year. Nothing. Zero statistical difference between those two people on average across 8 billion when you test for the whole population and adjust for incomes and cultures. What does that tell us about our metrics of success? It tells us that I'm not saying that they're incorrect, but they're certainly at the very least incomplete. We need something beyond achievement, accumulation, status, and experience by which to measure success. So what else is there? Mark Twain, in my view, put it best. He said, the two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. Why is that relevant and groundbreaking? Because he's attaching success not to any of those traditional metrics of achievement, accumulation, status, and experience. He's attaching it to purpose. He's saying success and life satisfaction actually depends on purpose. So now we have these three things that we see that we need, at least these three things. We need an anchor for our identity outside of the storm. We need some dependable object of trust in which to place our dependence. And we need a metric of success that's somehow related to purpose rather than getting stuff and having stuff and doing stuff. And so if we look then finally to this Easter story that people keep talking about and see what it has to say and what it has to offer, it's astonishing that it speaks directly to these three things. It speaks to a lot more as well. But at least for the purposes of today, it speaks to these three things. On our need for an anchor outside of the storm, it offers the existence of a personal and sovereign God that sits outside of the system. A sovereign God that's genuinely, physically and metaphysically above and outside of the storm. In relation to our need for something dependable, it offers us a personal savior. So not just that this God's out there outside of the storm, but he then steps into the world as a person, takes all suffering and struggle and uncertainty and darkness, takes all of the storms literally and cosmically onto himself as a person in human history. Dies on a cross in human history. God as a person rises from the dead, thereby affirming who he is, according to all the biographies and evidence we have for it. And now, astonishingly and ridiculously, reaches out to all people with an open invitation for up close and personal and trustworthy and dependable relationship. So we have this transcendent God that's outside of the storm. We have this personal savior that's offering a genuine object for relationship and dependence. And then what about purpose? It's interesting that Mark Twain said what he said the way he said it, because 2,000 years earlier, when Jesus was asked what the meaning of life is, Jesus responds effectively a couple of thousand years before it happened to the Harvard longitudinal study that says there's no correlation between all these metrics of success and life satisfaction. Jesus is asked, then what is? He's actually asked by a lawyer. It's always the lawyers that get beaten up in the Bible. He's asked by a lawyer, what's the greatest commandment? When you actually look at the original language of what he's asked, if you look at the cultural context, what he's effectively being asked is, what are we meant to do? What's the meaning of life? Right, just tell us what we're supposed to do. And Jesus says, go and love God and love other people. Now, Jesus is classy, so he doesn't smack this guy down. He reframes the answer, but he's not actually answering that question. What he's actually saying is, it's not so much what you do. It's not a commandment. It's two sets of relationship. Those are your purposes. Your purposes aren't to follow rules or commandments. Your purposes are to go and invest in these two categories of relationship. Go and commit to your relationship with God and go and commit to your relationships with other people. The people in your workplace, the people in your family, the people on your street, the people in your community, the people that love you and the people that hate you. Go and invest in those relationships and invest in relationship with God. That's what you're here for. So Jesus is asked what we're meant to do, what the meaning of life is. He's asked the Mark Twain question, what's the purpose? And he says, you were made for two purposes, to be in loving relationship with God and in loving relationship with one another. That's it. That's actually the entire Easter story and Christian message. So if anyone asks you, what's the meaning of life? For the Christian, it's quite easy. It's to be in right relationship with God and right relationship with other people. everything I've told you, I did tell you I was a lawyer and a political advisor, but I've only told you one lie. I've only lied to you once this afternoon. Everything else was correct. At the beginning, I said that the plaque on JFK's desk said, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small." That was not correct. The plaque actually reads, "Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small." It's actually from a prayer. It was given to JFK by one of his Navy admirals in the middle of the Cold War. And the reason it's important and speaks to everything I've talked about is because when you understand that it's not our storm and our sea, that there is actually a God that sits outside of it. And on top of that, he's actually willing to step into your boat if you are willing to keep an open heart and an open mind about who he is and to keep journeying wherever you are in this journey of faith, whether you're loving it, you're hating it, you're confused by it, you're dragged along here just for the free lunch, doesn't matter. That's the offer on the table for everyone, for all of us. And that's the way we can have access to, in an up close and personal and relational way, the anchor outside the storm that we need, the object of dependability, the person of dependability that we need, and the ultimate purposes for which we were made. To be in right relationship that way and to be in right relationship with each other too. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so this is a personal question from someone. So my life is fairly safe and stable and enjoyable. There doesn't seem to be any storms. What does Easter have to offer me?
That's great. I'd love to meet you. No, and that's a very fair question, and a really important one, I think. Look, there's a lot that could be said. Three very quick points, because I was in this place from time to time. I'm in it now sometimes for about a couple of hours, and it moves on. But I think the three reasons I would suggest very quickly, and we're not exhaustive, just three of many. Truth is indispensable, suffering is unavoidable, and happiness is not enough. So the first and most important reason why I'm a Christian is because it's true. And so I think the evidence and the actual truth value of it is incredibly important for me and powerful. And we don't want to live a lie, right? That's why at the end of that movie, The Truman Show, everyone was kind of rooting for it to get out. Because no one wants to just be happy on the premise that they're being lied to, or that their friends are not their real friends, or that everything's just a facade. We want truth. There's a deep longing in every human heart for truth. The second is that suffering is unavoidable. Like, we're broken and our world is broken. Doesn't matter what you believe. So it's coming for you. It's wonderful if you're not suffering, you've never suffered. But you might, I don't wish suffering upon you at all, but even if you don't, there are people around you that are suffering. In fact, I would go so far as to say that everyone in here is suffering on some level, or there's someone close to one of us that's suffering on some level. When that happens, you need a compelling response. And there are three things I think that all people need in suffering: comfort and strength to get through it, and hope beyond it. And the Christian message offers that. For me, the cross of Jesus Christ is the most astonishing, life-changing, grave-opening response to human suffering in human history. And the third is that happiness is not enough. And I think this is the important one, that we're not just here for that feeling of happiness. C.S. Lewis he was writing kind of pithily. He said, if happiness was all we were after, then all I would need would be a good bottle of whiskey and a few friends. Throw in some fried chicken and I'd be in agreement with that. But we're made for more than that. We're made for more than just happiness. And that's why the Bible doesn't really talk about happiness with any kind of seriousness. Instead, it talks about this thing called joy. And if happiness is about environmental sensory experiences, which is good, it's a good thing. And if you Google it or ChatGPT it or go to a dictionary, that's what it will tell you. But then if you go and Google joy, it will actually tell you that joy is just it's lots of happiness, that happiness is a component of joy. Which means that the conventional lexical range of the two words in most modern minds is that they're the same thing. And when Christians come along and say, no, what you need is joy, most people think, oh, that's just lots of happiness. Like, I get that. Like, a football premiership gives me that, or a decent night out with mates gives me that, or sex gives me that, or achievement gives me that. But that misunderstands the first principle of happiness and joy. According to the Christian message, they're qualitatively different, not quantitatively different. I used to make the mistake of thinking joy was just lots of happiness. And without God, that's definitely the case. That's the best definition you can have to joy. Without God, there's no difference for two different words. The only reason you'd have a different word for happiness that's joy is if there's a qualitative difference. And if happiness is based on short-term, environmentally, sensory experiences and moments, then joy is about, according to the Bible at least, unchanging eternal realities. That starts with being in right relationship with God. And so that's why I think if you're doing it right, the average Christian's levels of happiness go like this. Because the world's broken and we're broken. And the average seeker, skeptic, atheist, whatever, levels of happiness do the same thing. But joy is a qualitatively different thing, kind of hovers along the top here. It's outside the storm. It's qualitatively different. So there's still pain, there's still grief, there's still suffering, but there's this eternal existential reality that holds us anchored outside of the storm. So truth is indispensable, suffering's unavoidable, happiness is not enough. Take your pick, there's like 6 or 7 others. That's why it's still worth investigating.
Makes sense. Next question. What about the uncertainty attached to Christianity? How can I know it's a solid anchor worth attaching to?
Thank you for that question. And again, I grappled with this a lot. Are those questions from me in the past? A lot of my early walk with, I wouldn't even say walk with, investigation of Christianity was evidence-based and evidence-driven. I think as a lawyer, that's kind of where I was. I was naturally skeptical. I was taught to question everything. The critical thinking lens was very high. And I did that. I did that with the Christian faith. Both my parents were Christian. So I naturally didn't trust it because I didn't trust anything as being true. I was trained not to trust anyone. And I started asking questions about the propositional truth value of this thing, whether it's actually true, whether this thing actually happened, whether this Bible can actually be trusted. And as I did that, I found, astonishingly, there was all this evidence, all this propositional evidence that astonished me. Archaeological evidence, anthropological evidence, anecdotal evidence, psychological evidence, astronomical evidence, cosmological evidence. Like every field of human study I looked at that I had skepticism about, there were answers, reasonable answers. Reasonable answers that built enough of a case to me from which I could easily make that inference to the best explanation that it was true. And remember, that's all we're doing, regardless of what you believe here today. We're all doing inference to the best explanation. There's nothing in this space that we believe deductively. Deductive proof and deductive belief is stuff that you can prove without any doubt at all. You can deductively prove it as a certainty. The only proofs that humankind has in this is in the field of mathematics, including geometry in that space. Everything else, we're doing inference to the best explanation. We do a lot of stuff on faith. And so I just found the evidence quite overwhelming. And so I didn't have enough faith to be an atheist at that point. And I didn't have enough faith for any of the other worldviews that I investigated because the evidence was so strong. So the propositional truth value was important. But then something else happened because I don't think that's enough of an answer to that question because you still can't be 100% sure. Then I actually met the person of Jesus. And I met his people and I saw him in them. And I experienced quite obviously supernaturally in some instances, but also indirectly and naturally in other instances, the truth of who he was. And I realized that this Christian message is not just propositionally true, it's relationally true. Because only in the Christian message is the truth more than just a set of things to believe in. It's actually a person. Every other worldview, theistic or atheistic, is about someone or some group of people saying this is true, this is true, this is true. Only the Christian message has the audacity to step down and say, no, this is God just stepping into the world, pointing to himself and saying, I'm the truth. Now, I told you I was married to Fiona, wearing a wedding ring. Almost all of you haven't met my wife. You don't know that she exists. I might be full of it. I reckon if you gave me a few minutes, I could probably prove it to you, in my view, beyond a reasonable doubt. I could show you photos of us, probably got a digital copy of a driver's license.
You still might be lying.
Still might be lying. I could even, my friend and colleague Claire's here, she's met her. She could tell you about her. But I still could be lying. That's all in the propositional space. I think I could build a pretty good propositional case for her existence. Or I could just have brought her today and introduced her to me. That's the other way to verify truth claims. And because this Christian message is not just propositionally true, it's relationally true, that's how I knew for sure. That's what locked it in. And so people correctly can ask me, and they have asked me in debates and other things, well, if you saw enough evidence to the contrary, would you relinquish your faith? Of course I would. But it would have to be a lot of evidence. It would have to be the amount of evidence, the level of evidence would be the similar amount I would need to believe that my wife didn't exist. because that's the reality and the power of the relationship. That's the resonance and experience of my relationship with Jesus. I know it's propositionally true, but I know it's relationally true. And that's much more powerful. And most Christians, in my experience, most of my mates who are Christian, live in that space of the relational power. And so it should be. If the Christian message is true, it should be much more relationally compelling and life-changing than it is propositionally satisfying up here. That is there for us. If the thing standing in between you and a deeper investigation of this is the evidence, there is evidence there for you. Don't worry about that. You'll find it. You'll find it if you're willing to look. But if you're anything like me and anything like most people, problem's not really evidential. I just used to dress it up as evidential. It was a moral problem. I didn't want to investigate because I was worried about what that would mean for me. I was worried about what I might have to give up. Well, I can only tell you this as a person. I don't have any data beyond myself and all the people I know that have done this. That Jesus Christ would never, if you could find a better deal than what he has to offer, he would be the first one to tell you to take it. If you could find a better deal than what he offers, he would be the first one to tell you to take it. I've certainly found that in my life.
Thanks so much, Max. We still have so many questions. We've got 2 minutes left.
Sure.
I wonder if you could quickly answer one more and then I'll close. How can I invest in relationships if when I've done this, I've been hurt? That's very hard to, but yeah, go for it.
Yes. I'm so sorry for that. And I think all of us here would be feeling an element of that question and standing with you. I think we've all been there. And it is a difficult thing, and it's because people are just terrible. But one thing that taught me was that the Bible diagnoses that. If what the Bible says is true, you would expect this kind of hurt to come from being vulnerable and investing in relationship. And so what I would say is that you don't need to, and you need to do, I would advise you to do one thing that the Bible says again, which is to guard your heart. So there is a degree to which we each need to be careful of other people, and there are hurtful people out there, and there are hurtful situations out there, and we need to be responsive and agile and thoughtful and prayerful about the kinds of relationships and friendships that we expose ourselves to. And loving people and loving all people doesn't mean investing in relationships actively with all people. So we still have to use discernment. We have to use the best we have in advice and wisdom and psychology and science and all of those things. But when you're in a relationship with Jesus, your identity is so anchored. And when you're plugged into a group of people that also know him, they will be there to stand with you and to hold you up. And that's not to say that some of these people that, of course, hurt are not Christians themselves. That will happen too. Christians are just as terrible as all people. But I would just counsel you to guard your heart and be careful and prayerful, but also to not give up on all people just because of the hurt that you've experienced. What Jesus did on that cross is much more important in your life than what any given person has done to you in your life. And that will get you through if you open your mind and heart to him and investigate with him. And in the meantime, remember that relationality is what we were built for. It is part of our purpose. And so don't give up on that because this thing called life is meant to be a team sport. We're meant to do it together. So don't entirely give up. And if it's okay, because that's the last question, and because my colleagues here at G would punch me if I didn't do this. We're from the Centre for Public Christianity. And so if you want to find out a bit more about us and what we do, our social media handles are just one word, Public Christianity, on Instagram and Facebook, that's right. And our website is www.publicchristianity.org. No AU needed. Check us out, follow us, subscribe. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Max.
Bless you guys.